as the Chief Talent Officer at Granger, before that president of a subsidiary at IDEX, and before that president of another subsidiary at Eaton. So Midwest industrial expert. And she is a trusted advisor because of those things. When I was on a small 4-person search committee as part of the board at Badger Meter, and we were looking for a successor to Rich Musin. Suzanne was my candidate for search, and thank goodness I was able to convince the 3 guys that indeed she was the best person to do this search, and they all agreed, especially when we got the result we did, which has been really terrific. I think it's because of the background that she had, but it was more than that. It was her, I think, combined with her ability to really advise. And so that's why I say she's not only accomplished, but she's really a trusted advisor. And we got to be friends as a result of that, which is really lovely. And actually, we had the last drink in public before the shutdown of COVID. I met Suzanne in Washington for a drink at one of the local hotels, and the next day everything shut down. So we have a very memorable occurrence together. So I know that you all will enjoy getting to know Suzanne today and listen to her advice, because she has really good advice. So Suzanne, it's a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much, Gail. I hope we can get together again and have another drink soon.
And I hope the plague doesn't come again after that.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm originally from Milwaukee, so
that was the other reason.
Yeah, city is near and dear to my heart, so glad to be here and happy to help in any way.
Great, thank you, Gail, and welcome, Suzanne. So, just a few little ground rules too. We do want your questions. If you have questions that you're interested as we go through the program today, that you'd like to post to Suzanne, I'll be monitoring the chat. So I'm going to try to multitask and do that. And I can weave your questions in possibly to our conversation. So please feel free to do that. All right, great. Suzanne, why don't we just kind of start, if you want to give us a little introduction to yourself and maybe more specifically how you got involved in board search and your work specific to board level placements.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, as Gail mentioned, I started my career with Eaton Corporation, which for those of you in Milwaukee who've been there for a while, Cutler Hammer is also an institution in the Milwaukee area, and was with Eaton for 17 years. And that's really where I grew up in business. And one of the things that I was taught at a very early age was the expectation that leaders give back and find different ways to do that. And they encouraged us when we were probably a director level within an organization to seek out our first nonprofit board. And as a result of that, you learn so much about yourself and interacting with people that come from very diverse backgrounds than you, and being able to advise and influence. So I credit Eaton for that and the journey, and I've been involved with nonprofit boards ever since. And I know today there are different people on the call that are in different points of their journey, but if you haven't considered that, strongly encourage you to do to think about that and do the same. I also then had the opportunity between Eaton and IDEX and Granger to witness 10 CEO transitions over the course of my career, and the role that the board played in that, and how new CEOs came on board in that process. And so that really has shaped my opinion on the role of the board and the importance that a board plays in really thinking ahead and making sure that contingency plans are in place as well. Within Spencer Stewart, I spent about 50% of my time on board work, and particularly focused and very personally committed to diversity, both from a gender and a race and other forms of diversity standpoint. So I have a tendency to have a diversity element in almost every board search that I do. And we have a dedicated board practice. And the firm, you may or may not know, fills about 65% of the world's board of director roles. And so that's really an area where we specialize, and that can be from small, family-owned businesses all the way up to Fortune 50 businesses. So we run the gamut, and would love to take this time to share what we've learned through that process.
Great, thank you. And we are going to cover a lot of ground today as far as understanding how to both be discerning in your selection of the right boards to serve on, as well as kind of the skills that boards are looking for in placing people on their own board. But maybe to start with your perspective, Suzanne, why is board service important, and what do you think our participants or our members should think about when they make that decision?
Well, I think the first consideration is what type of board you're considering. As I mentioned, starting out on a nonprofit board is a great foundation for learning about the governance and the process of working together in an advisory capacity. Some of you may be running businesses or running parts of businesses, and board service is very different than so it's a way to kind of put your toe in the water and give back at the same time. So really encourage that. And then if you've done that for a bit and you're ready to move on to a for-profit board, one of the things that we advise when people come to be and they're thinking about their first for-profit is making sure that the first board you're on, you can really hit a home run. That it's right within your wheelhouse of what you do really well. You're comfortable with the chemistry with the other board members, and you have the time to commit to it and do it well. Particularly if you're currently a working executive versus being retired. And that's so important, particularly if down the road you decide that you want to add to your board portfolio. It's an interesting phenomenon happens. You're often referenced off of that first board more so than you are your executive career. So having a good reputation and getting strong references from your first board experience is really important if you decide to continue in that vein.
Great. So once you've made the decision to serve, what does the journey look like for maybe someone, and maybe take it from the perspective of someone kind of earlier in their career versus someone later in their career? What does that look like?
Sure. So I've talked a lot about nonprofit, and unless people want to go into that deeper, happy to do that. But that is a good first step. Advisory boards are another possibility. Sometimes these are compensated at a lower level, although there is compensation, but often you're serving as an advisor to family-owned businesses where the family is ultimately making the decision, but they have sought outside advisors out to provide information that they may not have or experiences they may not have. So that could be a next step. And I would say 30 to 40% of boards right now are not requiring, and this is for-profit boards, not requiring prior board experience. Again, particularly for diversity board placements. I believe that everybody received a copy we publish every year, the Spencer Stewart Board Index. And if you haven't, there's some very rich information in there in terms of statistics. But in terms of new independent directors that were brought on this year, and this is from the S&P 500, 47%, 22% of them were people of color or other types of minorities. And 28% of the new directors were first-time directors. So what we see is that the opportunity for people for first-time board, as well as boards, are dipping a little bit deeper into the organizations. We talk about level 1, level 2, level 3, level 1 being CEO, direct reports to CEO, and then the roles below that. And sometimes we're going to level 3 to find board members that have the right skill set to also match some of the diversity criteria.
Thank you. Our world is changing every day, right? But it's changed a lot in the last year. What are you seeing as far as trends for what boards are looking for in recruitment that might be different from the more recent last few years?
Sure. Well, the information got a lot of attention the last couple of months. So, we're seeing that on top of the fact that very large investment firms and private equity firms are requiring, if they have a significant position on in terms of holding on the companies, they're asking for more representation, and this is both female, and we're getting a sense that it's trending towards race as well. California has put specific rules in place around the number of women they want on a board. So 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 7 need to be women. Europe and Australia are also increasing the gender balance on their board, but through legislation. So we're seeing quite a bit of activity from that perspective. But also in light of George Floyd and everything this country has gone through this last year, more and more boards are just saying it's the right thing to do to add diversity. And so that it's a very hot topic right now for a lot of nominating and governance chairs to consider.
Great. So we'll spend a little bit of time just covering kind of nonprofit boards, but then we'll spend more of our time weighted towards for-profit boards, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
So maybe just on kind of the different types of boards that people consider, where should someone start their selection process of where to serve, and then how can they be seen or be visible to those seeking board members?
So on the nonprofit side, my advice is always go with your heart and where you have a passion. In my case, that's always been around women and children issues for the most part. Although I just joined the Chicago Botanic Garden Board as well, but it was really about the sense of community that it creates for families in light of the COVID situation. So you're not being compensated for the board, and you want to get something out of it as well as give. And the feeling of giving back and something you're passionate about is really, really important. I'd encourage you, as you consider those, to also do your homework and take a look at the 990s for the organization and other and reputational interests of the organization as well, because once you're a board member, you're tied to it for better or worse. So make sure that you do your homework as well.
Yeah. So when you kind of make a placement and spend some time, working within that nonprofit, what are some unique considerations maybe that are specific to nonprofit boards that are different from what we'll talk about in the for-profit boards?
I think there are a couple. So within nonprofit, you often, as I alluded to earlier, get a very diverse mix of people who serve on boards for various reasons. So they may not all come from business backgrounds. They may have had a child who was treated by a hospital, or they may have had somebody else who was connected with the, personally who's connected with the organization in some way, and come from all walks of life. So it's an exercise in really learning how to come together as a group and teach each other how to govern and lean on each other's strengths. So often what we recommend for nonprofit boards is they do kind of an audit of where are your strengths, and make sure that you're relying on each other through that and the various backgrounds. Some nonprofit boards can be very large, and that can be a little bit more difficult, but particularly for more manageable size, it's worth going through that about once a year, because nonprofit boards also turn over usually much faster than for-profit boards. The other is there are some nonprofit boards that are really all about fundraising, and you join and there's an expectation of writing a check, in some cases a fairly large check as contribution, and those are usually for the more prestigious nonprofit boards within a community. But there are other boards that really want you to be much more hands-on. So it's almost as if you're an extension of management. So making sure you understand what your role and responsibilities will be as a member of that board is important.
Sure. So as with any kind of a typical job search, you're looking to understand the expectations in both directions. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So once someone feels they're ready, I guess, when does that switch get flipped to the for-profit board? What do you see in most of the candidates you work with? And what are companies? Help us dispel the mystery of what are companies typically looking for? I know that's a wide-ranging answer likely, but maybe start where you'd like to start.
Sure, absolutely. So one of the most important things as you're considering a for-profit board is determining where you are in your career and what can you say you're really an expert in, where you can serve more as an advisor versus learning and doing. And often when I work with women who are putting their first board bio together, for example, which is very different than an executive resume, the first question is, okay, what is your value proposition to the board? What is it that you know better than anybody else over your, and the experience and expertise you've gained cumulatively over your career? And usually you can get that down to somewhere between 3 to 5 items that you are the subject matter expert, because thinking about a placement on a for public board from a search perspective is very much about a round peg and a round hole. The specifications for the boards are written very tightly. They are, we want a woman who can be a financial expert, who has experience with process manufacturing, has done a lot of acquisitions, and has lived in 2 continents. So we get we get very, very specific on the criteria sometimes. And so in doing so, you want to give yourself enough flexibility that you can hit most of those, right? And how you position yourself, and not too narrowly. But at the same time, when you go in to interview for the role, you have to be able to demonstrate your expertise in those given areas. Traditionally, and even with the board index that just came out, the average age for somebody joining a nonprofit board is around 54 for the first time. However, as I mentioned before, that's going down, particularly as we're looking for more diversity and more expertise in areas that are newer to industry. So I spent a lot of time in digital, and we just had a conversation with the search committee for a board earlier today, where they're doing a digital board director search. And said, are you comfortable bringing somebody in that may be in their late 30s, early 40s, because they they probably know the latest and greatest and have a different type of diversity, regardless if they're male or female or person of color. The fact that they're young on a board provides diversity as well. So we do see the age changing. The other thing about for-profit boards, if you consider public, is there is more scrutiny and more visibility around what governs public boards versus private boards. So that's always a consideration. Within private boards, you have the option, like I said, of family owned before or private equity. There's different forms of private, but really knowing what you're getting yourself into in each of those situations, because the dynamic is very different. Decision-making authority can be different. Who's involved in the committees can be different. So making sure you do your homework on that. And lastly, and some people underestimate this because they're just so anxious to get on their first board, is really the chemistry with the other board members. Before COVID, our board searches used to take longer than our executive searches because every board member wanted to take the candidate to dinner. and then we had to match schedules. And everybody wanted to have a meal with a person just to see, okay, am I going to like to sit around the table with this person? And if we have to be in the trenches together, work through tough issues with this person. It's now different in a COVID world. We just had a conversation, same conversation earlier today. Can we meet these board members completely virtually and make a decision? And the decision came back yes. So that's quite a shift as well. But unlike an executive position or unlike a nonprofit, the for-profit boards usually have a much longer tenure associated with them unless something material happens, the company gets bought out or there's some sort of impropriety, et cetera. So think of it as probably in the neighborhood of a 10 to 15 year commitment for most boards, unless something unusual happens. So those are a number of things to consider. Sorry for the long laundry list, but at the end of the day, it's just important to do your homework.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. And I don't think we're done with the laundry list because I have one more kind of follow-up question to that. You talked about the square peg the round peg in the round hole. And obviously, I'm sure, the majority of the time that fit works. What advice do you have for our membership of what to watch out for? Where maybe you've seen things that didn't work or something that didn't get vetted appropriately? Any reasons why someone shouldn't join a board or has made the decision to not join?
Well, the situations that I've run into where somebody has joined a board and it hasn't worked out have been for a couple of reasons. One is chemistry that we just talked about. Either the person acted very different in the interview process than they did when they got into the boardroom, or the board acted differently than the way they represented themselves. So that's one. Not having everything disclosed as part of the due diligence process, and from a financial standpoint, strategic standpoint, litigation, that happens sometimes. We try our best to make sure it doesn't happen, but our clients don't have to tell us everything either. They tell us what they want. So important to do the homework as much as possible. And then sometimes strategically, there's just a separation on the board where there's a group that wants to go one way and a group that wants to go another. And, there's a winner and a loser. And so we see people fall off boards that way. If you're considering a board, the watch outs I would suggest would be, making sure that you have the time to commit to a board and really understanding what the expectation was. We had the same conversation earlier today, which is there was a new board member that was part of the search committee, and she was saying, this was sold to me as 4 meetings a year, plus maybe a dinner the night before. And she said, and it's turned in from that to probably that plus 3 phone calls a month that are coaching sessions with one of the members of management. And, and she went on, she said, we just need to be honest with people in terms of what the real time commitment is. And I thought she raised a good point, because especially if you're a working executive and trying to balance a board, and one of the things I encourage everybody, if you're considering a for-profit, is make sure you've asked your CEO or your board for permission to serve, because that's one of the first things we're going to ask, and it's not a guarantee that that's the case. But as part of that conversation, they're likely to ask, what do you think the time commitment's going to be as well? And you want to make sure that that's reasonably accurate.
No, good advice. I think that comes back down to expectations too. What about board readiness and kind of advice for our membership on how to prepare ourselves to be great candidates as a part of that selection process? And then also on the other side of that same equation really is visibility. What advice do you have for our membership to be seen and to be, there when the call is needed?
Mm-hmm. So I would be happy if people are interested to send out a couple of white papers that we've written on preparing yourself to get ready for a board. And we're actually working on a new piece right now. So when that's ready, happy to share. But the first is really doing the homework that you need to on your board bio, and making sure that clearly describes the expertise we talked about earlier, and what your value proposition is to the board. And that's really your headline. And then, continuing to demonstrate how you have that expertise, and any other board service that you have. And then at the very bottom is actually the chronology of the roles that you had. So it's almost upside down from a traditional resume. So thinking through that, letting people know that you're interested. Word of mouth, particularly in the Midwest, is a powerful tool. So let friends and family and colleagues know that you're interested, and specifically what type of opportunities that you're interested in, so that they can keep that in mind. And then in terms of networking, there are a number of organizations that help women learn how to be good board members. So the one I'm most familiar with that we support is through Northwestern University in Chicago, and it's specifically dedicated to executive women who want to serve on boards. And it's a couple of day program where you actually stay at their executive center, and it's kind of immersion on governance, if you will, but very, very worthwhile program. There are national organizations like Women Corporate Directors, and Catalyst and others that are doing a lot to promote women in the boardroom. And often companies will go to those organizations saying, here's a specification of somebody of the type of person I'm looking for, before they hire a search firm, because it doesn't cost them anything to be able to find the talent. So connecting with those type of organizations. NACD, which is another incredible organization, the National Association for Corporate Directors, is also a great resource for both networking. It's both for men and women. It's all corporate directors, and probably the hallmark organization around governance. But they have education opportunities, they have networking opportunities. So that's another great one to tap into.
Yeah, no, that's great. Is there, I know search firms such as Spencer Stewart can help with the process. What percentage of board searches go through a search firm versus just a network, the Power of the Midwest network or something like that?
Yes. It really depends on the type of organization. I would say if you're talking about public companies, the percentage goes up considerably, because they want the best and brightest, and they want the reach that a search firm can usually provide. So for those type of firms, I would say at least north of 85% go to search. If you're talking about other types of private companies, family companies, probably on the other extreme of more of a friends and family program, until they hit a certain point where they realize, and we did a couple of these board searches last year, that they just need some professional expertise that they don't have within their network. And when we talk about digital, for example, we did one where they realized that they just didn't know anybody that would likely come from that space, and they decided to hire us to do that. Private equity is interesting. We see the number of independent directors on private equity portfolio companies increasing. Traditionally, there have been one or two. We have some clients now that are up to 3 independent directors plus 3 members of the private equity firm. And they usually hire search firms to do their work. So it really depends on the ownership structure of the company.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Are there particular roles that are harder to fill on boards? Or I would say you mentioned digital a few times. Is that a harder role to fill because of lack of experience, or are there other ones that are difficult to fill?
So I mentioned digital because it's kind of under the same category in my mind as ESG. It's a topic that is spoken about readily, but there, at least within the industrial world where I come from, there aren't many natives that come out of that space. So we find most of the digital talent, for example, in B2C companies, financial services, Silicon Valley, et cetera, and we bring them into industrial. And ESG is a concept that is people are just getting their arms around in terms of understanding the implications of all of that. So there are fewer people for more spots, if you will. So it's really a supply and demand issue for some of those type of roles. We also, when we get down the path of diversity, we start talking about P&L leaders of color or women P&L leaders, and there's a certain number of people that are known. What we're trying to do very actively is get to know more people who might not be known by us or might not have even thought about serving on a board that fit those qualifications. And because we don't know everybody, so it would be great to get to know people, because there's significant requests out there, and most of the time those people have 3 or 4 board opportunities when we're working with them to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it sounds like it's a bit of an art and it's a bit of science to find the right placement. Okay.
Very much.
So how does the true due diligence vetting process look to you, both from the board, the seated board perspective, as well as from the individual who's being considered perspective? What kind of things do you see working well, or what advice do you have for our group?
So, so in terms of the process itself, most boards, nominating governance committees lead the process. It really kind of depends on the bylaws. Sometimes they set up a separate search committee to do this, but it's usually a group of 4 to 5 people. That's a subset of the board that run the process and vet the candidates until they have the finalists. As a candidate, you want to really understand all those people's backgrounds going into the interviews and where they might be coming from. Sometimes it's a panel interview with all of them at once. Sometimes it's one-on-one or two-on-one. So it really changes. But ultimately, they determine who the, say, 2 finalists will be that will meet all of the board members and the CEO if he or she is not a board member. And you know, through that process, you're going to ask for the information we talked about before. You're going to ask about litigation. You're going to ask about D&O insurance. You're going to ask about to see the financials and the strategic plan, and often do that under an NDA. And you really want to kick the tires. You want to understand how they govern, and are there age limits or term limits on board positions, or any other expectations that you should know going in. Do they have you slotted for a certain committee, or will you have a choice to choose your committee that you're associated with? You know, a lot of times people will come in with a financial background, and the board will just assume they're going to be a financial expert, and the person might not actually want to sit on the audit committee. So making sure there's an alignment there as well. That's all part of the due diligence on both sides.
Sure, that makes sense. How, I mean, not to divulge your entire recipe for the secret sauce, but how do you find qualified candidates? How do you, if I'm interested in serving on a for-profit board, how do you know about me? How does that process work?
Well, it's a great question, and I would say there's probably 4 or 5 different sources that we use for board search. Some of them, we may not use all 5 for any given search, but for the more difficult ones, we will definitely use all 5. So the first is we have as Spencer Stewart, we have an extensive database of over 4 million people. Between the search side of things and the board work that we do. So we know a lot of people, which is great. So that's one. Secondly, many of those people have been our candidates or our placements or clients in the past. So we can often reach out to those people and ask for recommendations. So that's where the word of mouth really comes into play. Because it's very helpful to be able to pick up the phone with somebody in the industry and kind of have an off the record conversation, say, here's what I'm looking for. Do you know anybody that you'd recommend? And people are often really forthcoming with ideas. And I know Gail is just fantastic when she gets calls about recommending other women. And I know a number of women who practice the Madeleine Albright philosophy of making sure that you pay it forward with recommendations. So so that's the second. The third is there are a number of databases out there that can be used. BoardX is one of them, for example, that if you, in fact, have served on boards, you would be a member of that. That's maintained by a third party, but you get on the registry, and it's very easy to be able to find people by different criteria and different types of service. Kind of beyond your control of whether or not you get on it or not. It's just a function of the research they do, but that's always a helpful tool. The fourth is really from our clients. Oftentimes we will take on a board search, they'll hire a search firm, and then we get 20 resumes from the existing board members who say, let us know your third party opinion about these people relative to the specifications. So they're hiring us to vet their friends, essentially, which we're happy to do as well, as long as we land on the criteria. And then the fifth really is networking, like we're doing right now, and just getting to know people and getting your name out there, even if you're not in our database yet. Going online, submitting your credentials, getting to know the search firms, and you personally reaching out and I had a situation last week where somebody did that, and I had the perfect board role for her, that came in the day before she called me. So it was really serendipity, but that, definitely use the power of search firms as well to get your name out.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think the cultural fit is always something that's hard, and that's where I think the friends of friends help, because that hurdle gets crossed. Maybe talk a little bit about, if there is a board opening, do you like to delve into kind of market specific within the same industry that you're searching for of that board seat, or do you like to look for someone with the right functional skills, but maybe a completely different industry?
It really depends on the client's appetite for that and how transferable the skills are. So in some cases, particularly in industrial, we'll hear the person has to have manufacturing, but we don't care what kind of manufacturing. So it doesn't have to be industrial manufacturing, but they can't come from a service business, for example, or a software business. In other cases, for digital, as I mentioned, we readily go outside of the industry because that's where some of the best talent is, as long as the board, and we always test this, has the appetite for bringing somebody in who just comes from a very different environment or paradigm than they might be walking into. And there's a recognition of that on both sides to make it work. Other times, I have a client right now who is in building products and is a PE-backed company, and they only want somebody from PE that has building products experience, because that's the outside perspective they need at this point in time. So it really varies by the strategic need of the board.
And then regarding board compensation, it's always a weird topic to bring up, but how does that get determined for for-profit boards?
Sure. So there's great data around average compensation in the board index, but again, that's the S&P 500. So that's much higher than you'd likely start out. There are a number of surveys out there. ERI does some great compensation work around board placements. There's different schemes in terms of compensation as well. So most boards have a component that it's your board fee that you get for serving on the board, and then you may get additive fees for chairing a committee, or you may get a fee associated with each board meeting you attend. You may also get an equity grant of some sort if it's a publicly traded company, or in a privately held company. It might be the equivalent of that in terms of the value that was created through a kind of actuarial model over the past year in cash or phantom shares or something like that. So there's definitely not a one size fits all. Advisory boards can, I've seen some advisory boards that pay $2,000 to $4,000 a year to sit on. Family company boards that are probably $65,000 to $90,000 a year. Private equity boards that are probably in the 80 to 120, plus some sort of longer term incentive when they exit the business, to public company boards that are north of 125 to, they can go up to well over $300,000-$400,000 depending on the size of the board. So it really differs dramatically, but always something that you should explore as well as part of your due diligence, and make sure that the time is worth your effort.
Align with expectations.
Yeah.
We had a couple questions came in from members, which I've already woven a few in, but one question I think we touched on a little bit at the beginning, but we'll kind of just make sure that this gets answered. First time. So if you haven't yet served on a for-profit board, I know several of our members do already, but
Mhm.
how does someone get their first experience without having experience, if that makes sense?
So this is a first time for-profit board?
Correct. Yes.
So that it's always the hardest nut to crack, is to get that first board, and also to exhibit the patience necessary to make sure it's the right board, because so many people are so excited when they do get asked, even if they may not feel like it's the best fit. I encourage people to use the same discipline around choosing a board as you do around a merger and acquisition strategy. When you just start having that feeling in your stomach like this is not right, go with that. So not jumping at the first one. But in terms of visibility, the more you can demonstrate a unique set of skills that are strategically needed in a company, and a combination of skills particularly, versus just focusing on solely being a financial expert, for example. But financial expert coupled with M&A, coupled with global, coupled with having led an IPO, I'll make it up, right? So different situations. The higher the likelihood is that you will get tapped. So that board bio is really important, and the combination of those skills is important.
I mean, clearly you know your stuff, and Gail gave you the testimony at the beginning during the intro. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the company you work for, Spencer Stewart? So the board index that we've received, but tell us a little bit about your company.
Sure. So Spencer Stewart was founded in Chicago. So it's a good Midwestern company, despite being very global now. We have over 50 offices around the world in over 35 countries. And we really, we consider ourselves a leadership advisory firm. Most people historically have thought us as executive search, and particularly kind of top of the house executive search. With the board work we do, and most of what we do is CEO and C-suite executive search. But that being said, we have expanded our offerings beyond executive search considerably, and we do a lot of work in board effectiveness. We have a team dedicated to that, that will bring new boards together, or troubled boards together, and figure out how to be more effective as a team. We do quite a bit of work around culture with our clients, particularly when they're changing strategies and they need to make sure that their culture aligns to where the strategy is headed, and how do you go about doing that. We do a lot around leadership assessment. We have an incredible tool that we now have a database of over 5,000 people who have taken it, that are current CEOs or future CEOs, that spend about 4 hours with one of our psychologists, going through some case studies that basically can predict the likelihood of them being successful as a CEO. And it's comparative data, and we use that for CEO succession work. Gail mentioned the work that I did with her and the Badger board, and so a lot of work around just making sure we have the right people and a plan in place for longer term succession. And then also we do quite a bit around the promotion and development of diversity across organizations, and that's something that we're really committed to, and helping organizations figure out what moving towards a more diverse organization looks like, and what they need to do to be able to get there.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you. I'm just checking the chat too. As one of our members said, is there something MWI can do for you, Suzanne?
Oh, that's very kind. one, if you are interested in boards and have, an interest, with, happy to receive your board bio and think about, where that might be a fit. So we're only as good as the people we know. So that would be the first. I love Milwaukee. My mother still lives in Milwaukee. Any chance I get to be in Milwaukee. So, if we're up there and you'd like to get together, happy to do that as well. And if any of your companies may be interested in the type of services that we talked about or going through those types of transformations, would be happy to speak with you about it as well.
Thank you. And then just one final question. I think Q&A, but feel free if anyone on the line has a question, pop it in the chat and we'll see that. So the final question before we conclude is any other factors or words of wisdom executives, our membership executives should expect for planning their own board career?
I'm going through this personally, and so I'm speaking a bit from experience, but you get to a certain point in your career and your life where, and I think this has also come through with some of the diversity work we've done, where you don't want to pretend to be anybody that other than who you are, and particularly to get that board role. I've talked to women who feel like they have to be, and I would just encourage everybody, be your authentic self, show up in the way that you want to be known as, and that is how we're going to make progress on this front, because the longer that we pretend to be somebody that we're not, then that's going to be the expectation. So we just have to change that expectation.
Oh, that's a fitting message to end on, I think, on this monumental day for women, right? So we really, really do appreciate your time, Suzanne. It's been delightful having you, and prepping for this even was so enjoyable with you. So our membership, I wish we could give you like a roaring round of applause. That's really hard to do on Zoom, but know that your time here is very appreciated by our membership. I think
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes. Great. We got a few waves goodbye. Good. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
So that really concludes our official program. We are, I don't know, Pat, did you have anything else you wanted to mention?
No, not really. This is a terrific program, and thank you, Suzanne, for sharing your insights, and that your message on authenticity versus assimilation was so refreshing to hear, because that's really the magic, where the magic comes from, the diversity, and where diversity really does add value when we show up as our authentic selves. So thank you for that, and thank you, Kristen, for moderating and really creating a wonderful hour of conversation with Suzanne. Thank you for that. And that concludes our program, our prepared program. So we have, if anybody would like to stay on and network and join conversation, feel free to do that. And I think we've got time, Jackie, allowed for another 30 minutes or so. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And for those of you that have to leave, and those that can stay on, and we'll enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Yes. See, we have 17. That was incredibly informative. Oh,
She was wonderful. I don't know. I think she hung up, so I can.